Close your eyes. Sahana bhavatu, sahanau phunaktu, sahaviryam karavavahai, tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vedvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Welcome everyone to the special webinar on yoga therapy or Chikitsa Krama Yoga. Tomorrow is the Global Yoga Therapy Day. So I thought it's a good occasion to have a short interaction and sharing about this particular aspect of yoga, which is not very popularly known or understood in the general understanding of yoga. So how I would like to go about this session is I'll just share my own journey into yoga therapy for a few minutes. And in that process, also share about how the idea of a yoga practice has different levels based on the ability and the location of the student or the practitioner. And perhaps you could also share with me if you are on the live session using the chat. Have you ever experienced yoga therapy? Is it an idea that is familiar to you? Or if you're watching up on the recording, you could perhaps leave a comment to share the same. So those of you who have joined right now, how many of you have experienced yoga practice as a therapy, yoga therapy? Maybe you can, I think the chat is enabled. You could share in the chat if you have. Are you familiar with the idea of yoga therapy or the Chikitsa Krama as it is? Yes, no. I see more of no than yes. Okay. So why don't I start with my own journey into this space? So I was someone who growing up got connected with yoga in my school days as one of the subjects in school. So I studied in Chinmaya Vidyalaya, run by Chinmaya Mission in Kerala. And the sessions, to be very honest, when I experienced as a 5th standard or a 6th standard child, felt very boring. And it was almost like another version of a PT class, where we were just randomly making some arm movements, leg movements, twists and turns. And for me as a child, it was much more appealing to join a karate class. So we had an option to choose between yoga and karate at that point. So I chose to be part of the karate class instead of the yoga class from 5th to about 12th standard at that time. But something interesting happened in that process. As I progressed in the karate, the different belts, we have a certain sequencing of belts that you have to appear to be trained in. and the 10th belt is the black belt. So at that point, I think in 11th standard, I was one belt before black belt. And when we were studying for that test for the brown belt in karate, I was told that once you clear the black belt, then the further studies include something called first dan, second dan, third dan. So some 9 levels after black belt, for which yoga is very important. So it really intrigued me at that time. I thought, okay, so in my understanding, black belt was something great. And but after that, if you have to do further studies, yoga has to be a very important part of that process. So it just left me intrigued. I didn't understand why that was necessary. Fast forward after that, 10, 15 years later, I got into a more serious study of yoga 7 years back, when I started experiencing a lot of, I wouldn't say big health issues, but a general dip in my energy, feeling lethargic in the mind. I was working in a corporate at that time with night shifts, and my digestion was gone a little haywire because of a lot of oily food and coffee and things like that. So I just got into yoga practice in a serious manner at that time, just to take care of my health. And that's when I realized there is this entire aspect of yoga, which is about how do you create a practice that is very unique for the individual. So I was more inspired by Yoga Sutras and the inner work aspect of yoga. So yoga has one layer or level of practice, which is called the Bahiranga yoga, or the yoga that you can actually watch and then practice for yourself. So if you are doing an asana practice, if I teach you to stretch your arms or twist your body, that's something I can demo once, and you can watch me do it and you can repeat it. They form part of the Bahiranga practice of yoga. Then there is the Antaranga practice of yoga, which is basically when you do the Bahiranga practice mindfully, with the awareness of your breath, whether it is asana practice or pranayama practice, it takes you to a space in your mind where the mind becomes very reflective, to a space of what we call as a shantam space of equanimity. From that location, you will be able to watch what's happening to you when an event occurs in your life. You will be able to watch the answers that comes up for you when you ask very fundamental questions of life, like who am I? Where am I right now? Why am I doing what I'm doing? All these kind of things without getting into a reactive mode. And this is very important, because the more I'm able to go into that space of shantam, a reflective, more I'm able to develop the reflective quality of my mind, I am able to also regulate my emotional space, retain its health, as well as allow the flow of prana to be more seamless within my system. And all vyati or illness has its origin when the movement of prana gets impacted in the body. How can movement of prana get impacted in the body? It can get impacted when you do not have a rhythm in your aharam, diet, viharam, lifestyle, and the entire gamut of what yoga proposes as the yama niyamas, the practices that one is recommended to adhere to at a personal level for yourself and in the interpersonal space with others. When any of these goes out of rhythm, you are setting yourself up for some kind of a vyati or illness. Just to elaborate a little bit more on this point, let's take a idea like ahimsa. Most of you must be familiar with ahimsa, right? What is ahimsa? Non-violence. So at a very literal level, ahimsa would mean how do I conduct with others in a way where I don't create himsa or violence? This violence need not always be like a physical violence. It could also be saying a word that hurts another emotionally. According to yoga, it could even be a thought that you're holding. So if I see you getting hurt by some life incident or somebody, and I feel a sense of joy, even that is an act of himsa. So if this is a practice, if ahimsa is a practice that I would like to practice in my life in the interpersonal space, what does yoga or Yoga Sutra proposes as a prerequisite for it? There are two aspects from niyama, that is something that you need to focus and work with yourself. So there is the idea of shaucham, cleanliness, and there's an idea of santosham or contentment. So yoga says shaucham and santosham are two important practices which are complementary and prerequisite if you are to develop the ability to practice ahimsa with others. Are you able to relate to this? If I don't have a certain sense of santosham or contentment in my life, am I more likely to act in a way that can create hurt for another? If I don't have a certain shaucham here means not just the cleanliness at a bodily level, it also means cleanliness of your thought. So at a thought level, it could mean lesser or more qualitative thoughts, which are in alignment with the highest good of yourself and the other and the context. So when I don't have shaucham in my thought process, am I more likely to end up in acting ways that can create hurt for another? So it's a very fascinating exploration to see these interconnectedness of different practices within yoga. Now, why are we talking about this in the context of Chikitsa Krama or yoga therapy? When it comes to yoga therapy, we work a lot with the manomaya, the mind space, and the pranamaya, the movement of prana within the body, much more than working with the annamaya, the physical body. So when you go for, if you're a person with a relatively good health, a practice that gets designed for you after consultation might involve a fair degree of asana practice, standing or lying down or seated, some pranayama, and then perhaps dharana practice as there is a need. But when it comes to yoga therapy or Chikitsa Krama of yoga, already the person is undergoing a certain therapeutic condition. Now, depending upon the nature of the therapeutic condition, like I have had many students during the COVID time, because that was the time I was completing my yoga therapy program, and we were supposed to do one research project on a specific condition. So I took up the research project for recovery of long COVID symptoms. So when a person recovers from COVID at that point, what I noticed was that the immediate aftermath of the COVID, it is very difficult to design a practice where they have to do a lot with the body for most people. Many of them had very short breath. Even if you were to raise your arm 5 times, it led to breathlessness and all these things. So a lot of practices in yoga therapy will focus more on how is the mind behind this body and how is this condition experienced in the mind. For instance, a lot of breathlessness and panic attacks that were emerging at that point for most of my students, I figured that it is not purely external. A lot of it is arising from the fear they are holding in their mind. So I had to work with the trigger in their mind, which is creating the bhayam or the fear. And for each person, what evokes a certain sense of courage to face life, viryam to face life, differs. Like I had a very senior knee replacement surgeon from a very reputed hospital in Hyderabad, who once came to me for a consultation, where he said, in a regular day, I'm completely fine. However, so he does a lot of social service in villages in Andhra. So he said when he goes to those spaces and he has to do his surgery and other things, because the setup is not very professional, if the support staff does something which is little out of sync with his expectation, he gets very triggered and angry. And once he gets angry, he finds it very difficult to focus, to have that kind of focus for the surgery. So for him, the only practice he wanted was, how do I retain my sense of calm when I'm there, where he goes once in 2 weeks or whatever. And when I spoke more to him, I figured that for him, what evokes that certain sense of stillness, quietness, and anchorage when everything else goes haywire was the image of a banyan tree. So we did some practices. The asana component was lesser. We had a lot of pranayama to help him connect to the breath in the inner space. But then there was a long dharana practice to bring this image which he feels evoked into the mind space and do dharana or meditation on that. So in Chikitsa Krama, the focus becomes a lot on the manomaya and the pranamaya of the person. And we also work at more subtler levels, primarily anchored with breath practices. So if one were to look at the overall nature of practices that one designs for a student, if the student is a very young person in their teenage or growing up years, it will be a practice which will be of the nature of what is called Shakti Krama, which could be intense because the body is malleable, it can be pushed and explode. So Shakti Krama really challenges the body, and it's a very exciting thing for a young person to do. Once you enter the middle age, 20s to 30s, the body already has a certain limitations and abilities. So the nature of practice will be of what is called Rakshana Krama. How do I retain what has already been developed as part of my growing up years? And how do I build on it? How do I prevent deterioration so that I can perform whatever functions I need to perform? And then as you age, the nature of practice will change to Adhyatmika Krama, which is obviously there is a body will go through a natural stage of deterioration of its own, which is inevitable. So the practice will change to help the person connect and work more with their mind and breath, and which is also a little bit more spiritual in nature. So Adhyatmika Krama. Now, at any point of these three stages of practice through the life of a person, when they encounter a therapeutic condition, Chikitsa Krama can step in. And when Chikitsa Krama comes in, even if the person is otherwise doing a Shakti Krama practice or a Rakshana Krama practice, in Chikitsa Krama, they completely change the nature of their practice to adhere to first pacification, that is to, if it's a lot of pain, subside the pain, make it painless or recover from the condition. And then, so the pacification is called Shamanam. After Shamanam, you have the Shodhanam kind of practices, which is cleansing practices. So you build strength. For Shodhanam practice also, you need a minimum strength. So first you, in a therapeutic practice, you make sure that whatever is the main pain or struggle of the person, you take care of that, pacify that, help them recover from it, and then go into more cleansing practices so that they can come back to their natural state of health in that stage of life. From there on, they can go back to a Shakti Krama or a Rakshana Krama or a Adhyatmika Krama kind of a practice. Now, in my perspective or opinion, yoga therapy is something as an idea that needs to get more popular and more trusting by a lay person, because it is one of the most economical, safest, and has minimal side effects, unlike pumping in a lot of antibiotics and other things into your body for any condition, because it really helps you to awaken the natural inherent healing potential in your system. So it needs to gain more currency and awareness and trust among both layperson as well as medical practitioners. So my hope is that in the coming days, people and institutions, especially those who are in medical professions, are able to encourage their patients to take up yoga therapy as a complementary practice, along with whatever other things that they're doing for recovery. Because very importantly, yoga therapy focuses also on the experience of the condition by the person. So somebody can be diabetic from a report. A report can say, okay, you have crossed this level of data on the report number, and so you are now clinically diabetic. Now, this is a report and it's a diagnosis. How this diagnosis impacts the person can differ from person to person. There are people who might be what we call as highly diabetic as per the report, but who may not really experience any suffering because of that. In their mind, they might be doing whatever is required to be done. They might experience a lot of contentment in their life, and they'll go about doing things. But there are others who might be just, you can say, borderline diabetic, but who get so worried, and their experience of the condition can be so much more worrisome and anxiety driven and painful. Now, yoga therapy very importantly addresses how does the person really experience this condition? Can a shift be made there also? So even beyond curing, yoga therapy really looks at how do I heal my engagement with the emergent condition that is in my system. So these are some of the ideas I wanted to share regarding yoga therapy on the occasion of the Global Yoga Therapy Day, which is tomorrow, 14th of August. I will pause here. If any of you have any questions, you can type it in the chat. I can take it up now. Or if you're listening to a recorded version of this, you can leave a comment and maybe I can look at it and build on it in a later webinar. So any questions, any thoughts at this point after listening to what I have shared about yoga therapy? Yes, Steve. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, I'm wondering what are your plans for being able to train people to deliver yoga therapy more consistently?
So personally, if you ask me, I do not have a plan because I have learned it with my teacher Saraswati Vasudevan of Yoga Vakini. And it was a 3-year-long course. It was a very long course with a lot of work involved. So at this point, my focus is more on practicing yoga therapy as a therapist with more people who might require yoga therapy, share information so that there's more awareness of it, and also encourage more yoga teachers to take up yoga therapy from qualified teachers like Saras, so that there are more yoga teachers who are qualified to be yoga therapists. A lot of teachers today does engage with therapeutic conditions without necessarily, I believe, having the kind of training that is required. That is what I am seeing, which is also not a great thing because that can also backfire in a larger scheme of things and create more bias against yoga from a therapy point of view. So I don't have any plans to train teachers in yoga therapy because at this point, at least in the short term, because it's I myself, I feel is learning. But definitely, I would be wanting to encourage more teachers to take up therapy training also as an add-on to their own learning. And of course, there are teachers like Saras who can train them. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Okay, so I think if there are no more questions, we can close here. And thank you so much for joining today's webinar. So if you are listening to this live or recorded, and if you do know anybody who you feel might be exploring ways of dealing with the therapeutic condition, my request would be to also, amongst all the other things that you recommend, to also invite them to see if yoga therapy can be a useful method for engaging with whatever condition they are going through. If there is any need for a chat regarding this, to see the scope of yoga therapy for a specific condition, you can always feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to have a call or a chat regarding that. You can reach me on namaste@hariprasadvarma.com. And thank you so much for joining today. We'll end with a prayer. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamataya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you. Have a good day.